I'm Phyllis Warren. I am 73 years old. For most of my life, I lived in the hum of deadlines, shipments, and balance sheets, building a medical supply business from the back corner of my garage into something people in the industry actually knew by name. These days, the only hum I hear is from the bees that wander lazily among the lavender rows in my garden. The work is different now, slower, fragrant, rooted in soil instead of contracts. I thought this would be my quiet chapter. 3 weeks ago, that changed. The word stage 3 pancreatic cancer slipped from my doctor's mouth with the careful rhythm of someone trained to soften hard blows. He spoke of 6 to 12 months, maybe more if the treatments went well. I nodded almost politely, as if we were discussing a delayed delivery order instead of my life. That afternoon, I came home and set the orange pill bottle on the counter. The light slanted through the kitchen window and struck it just right, turning the capsules inside into tiny pale coins. I shook it once, the sound sharp and dry like dice hitting a wooden table. The phone rang while I was watching that light. Rachel's voice came through bright, but rushed, asking if she and David could come by this evening. She said there were things we needed to talk about, things about the future. I told her yes, and after we hung up, the air in the kitchen felt heavier. I knew what that tone meant. It was the same one she used when she wanted something, but did not want to say it out loud yet. I have been through this before. Years ago, when she was starting graduate school, she called with the same voice. She needed tuition money, and of course I wrote the check. Later, when she and David wanted a break, I let them use the vacation house for an entire summer. They returned it to me with chipped paint and water damage, and never mentioned paying for repairs. I let it go, telling myself that is what mothers do. Over the years, those moments piled up like unopened bills in a drawer. By the time the sun had dropped low, I had set the table and watered the garden to calm my nerves. At 6 sharp, their car rolled into the drive. I saw David glance at the front of the house, the way a buyer sizes up a property. Rachel adjusted her jacket, smoothed her hair, and when they stepped inside, their smiles looked practiced. Behind them, the evening light stretched across my floor in long, thin shadows, and I felt the old instinct rise, the one that told me a negotiation was about to begin. Rachel and David sat on the edge of the sofa as if they were guests in a stranger's house. Rachel crossed her legs, smoothing her skirt, while David rested his elbows on his knees, his eyes scanning the room in quiet appraisal. The living room still carried the scent of the lavender. I had cut earlier, a faint reminder of the calm I had felt before they arrived. Rachel started with small talk about the weather and how lovely the garden looked, but her gaze kept flicking toward the picture window that framed the water beyond my backyard. When she finally leaned forward, her tone softened in a way that made the air in the room grow heavier. She said she and David had been talking and thought it might be best for me to sell the house. She said it would be easier for everyone if I moved in with them. They could take care of me, she explained, and I would not have to worry about the upkeep of a big property. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the words settle between us. David added that the market was strong and my home could fetch a remarkable price right now. He went on to say he could help invest the proceeds. He promised he could place the money into something safe, something that would grow while giving me security. His voice had the smooth confidence of someone who had delivered that pitch many times before. I nodded without agreeing, my fingers curling slightly against the armrest. I could tell they had already done their homework. The way Rachel glanced at David after each point told me they had rehearsed this conversation. They knew the value of my property. They likely had the numbers memorized. What they did not know was that 3 months ago I had sold my company and placed $8 million where they could not touch it. David shifted in his seat, lowering his voice as though speaking about something delicate. He said he knew my treatments would be costly, but there were cost-effective options that might be worth exploring. The words struck me like a sudden drop in temperature. I understood in that moment that they were not just talking about selling my home. They were weighing the price of my life against the size of my bank account. I set my teacup down carefully, making sure it did not rattle against the saucer. My heartbeat felt slow and steady, even as a quiet anger took root in my chest. I asked them what exactly they meant by cost-effective. Rachel avoided my eyes, her voice quick and light, saying only that there were treatments that might be just as good for less money. David jumped in again, smiling faintly, as if charm could hide the calculation behind his words. He spoke about simplifying my life, consolidating assets, preparing for the future. I kept my gaze fixed on him, letting him talk, every sentence revealing more of what they wanted. Inside, I was already closing the door on their plan. When Rachel reached for my hand, I gave it to her, letting her think I was still listening with an open mind. In truth, I was memorizing the look in her eyes, the mixture of pity and anticipation. The conversation drifted into talk about how much easier life would be if I trusted them to manage everything. I smiled faintly and said nothing, holding the silence long enough for them to start filling it with more promises. By the time they finished, I'd heard enough to know exactly where they stood. They saw my illness as a problem to be managed and my assets as an opportunity. I walked them to the door with a calm that came from knowing something they did not. Their plan was already dead, and they had no idea I had just decided how to bury it. It was close to midnight when the house finally felt still again. The lavender scent from the garden clung to the air, mixing with the faint hum of the refrigerator. I was in the kitchen rinsing my teacup when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something in me answered before I could think. The voice on the other end was deep, warm, and carried a trace of an accent I had not heard in decades. He said his name was Marco Silva, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. 30 years fell away in an instant. I saw a younger version of myself, still raw from losing my husband, meeting a young Portuguese man who worked in my warehouse with a quiet diligence that made him stand out. We had shared a brief season together, full of late-night talks and unspoken promises before life took us in different directions. Marco said he had heard about my illness from an old mutual friend. His voice tightened slightly as he told me he also knew about Rachel's plan to take over my finances. He spoke with certainty, not guessing, as if he had already confirmed every detail. I felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. Someone knew the truth, and it was someone who once cared for me without wanting anything in return. He told me I had options. I did not have to let my daughter decide how my final months would unfold. He described his villa by the sea in Algarve, a place with whitewashed walls, a garden that looked out over the cliffs, and the steady sound of waves. He said he could help me set up legal protections so my assets would be safe, far from the reach of anyone who might misuse them. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to trust him after so many years. My mind played through the practicalities, the risks, the uncertainty. Yet in the background was the memory of how he once treated me. There had been no calculation in his eyes back then, only kindness and an easy humor that made the days feel lighter. He said I did not need to answer right away. He only wanted me to know I had a place to go, and that he would help me without expecting anything in return. His words settled over me like a soft blanket on a cold night. I realized I'd been living without hope for weeks, and now with one unexpected call, a thin but steady current of it ran through me again. When we hung up, I stayed at the kitchen counter, staring at the dark window and the faint reflection of my face. I imagined the sound of the ocean he had described, the feel of the sun, in a place where no one saw me as a burden. For the first time since my diagnosis, I thought about the future and felt something other than dread. It was small and fragile, but it was hope all the same. The call went through on the second ring. My attorney's voice was groggy but alert once he heard mine. I told him I needed to meet right away. There was no small talk, only the quiet understanding that after 25 years of trust, if I called in the middle of the night, it was serious. By 1:30 a.m., I was sitting in his dimly lit office, the desk lamp casting a narrow pool of light over a neat stack of folders. The building was silent except for the hum of the old air conditioner. I slid the documents from my bag and explained exactly what I wanted. revoke the power of attorney I had given Rachel, set up charitable trusts in my name, move the rest into accounts beyond her reach. His eyes searched mine for a moment, then he nodded and began pulling the necessary papers from his files. As he worked, I watched the pen in his hand glide over forms, filling in dates and names. The sound of paper shifting under his fingertips felt like a drumbeat, each movement steady and sure. I signed my name again and again, the ink flowing smoothly each curve of my handwriting, a quiet reclaiming of what was mine. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, not from joy, but from knowing I had taken back control. In the back of my mind, I began crafting the cover story. Rachel would never hear a word about Portugal. Instead, I would tell her I had found an experimental treatment program in Mexico. It would be believable enough to explain my absence and would keep her from suspecting the truth. She would assume the rest of my money was slowly disappearing into hospital bills. That illusion would keep her comfortable while I made my real plans. When the last page was signed, my attorney placed the stack into a locked drawer and gave me a look that needed no words. We had always dealt in trust and discretion, and tonight was no different. I stood slipping my coat over my shoulders, the weight of the fabric feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Outside, the street was empty, the air cool and still. Driving home, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. My life was still under threat, but it was mine again. I no longer felt like a cornered woman waiting for the inevitable. I was moving, acting, choosing. The game had shifted, and this time I would decide how it ended. Marco knew exactly how to bait the hook. A quiet call to an acquaintance in Porto planted the story that I had checked into a private medical clinic for advanced treatment. He made sure the details sounded just vague enough to invite curiosity, but official enough to be believed. What Rachel did not know was that the so-called clinic was in fact a psychiatric facility with strict security protocols. 2 days later, the phone in my villa buzzed with a message from Marco. Rachel had shown up unannounced, demanding to see me and insisting she was my next of kin. When staff refused, she shouted in the lobby, accused them of hiding me, and tried to push past the reception desk. Security called the police, who arrived just in time to witness her throwing a clipboard onto the floor. The incident was logged in a police report, and she left in a fury with nothing to show for it but public embarrassment. I sat on the balcony of the villa as the sun dipped low over the Algarve coast, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. A chilled glass of Vinho Verde rested in my hand, the condensation cooling my fingertips. Marco's message ended with a wry note that she would think twice before storming another building in my name. I let out a quiet laugh, not of cruelty, but of satisfaction. The plan was moving exactly as intended, each piece falling neatly into place. As the waves rolled onto the shore below, I realized I had not felt this level of control in years. It was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was a way to keep my life my own, to set boundaries that could no longer be crossed. Somewhere far from Porto, I was safe, and for the first time in months, I could sip my wine without feeling watched. The wooden gate creaked as it swung open. The hinges moved slow and deliberate, as if they were weighing the decision to let someone in. Golden light spilled across the stone path stretching toward the villa, where Marco leaned on the balcony rail, his gaze calm but alert. Rachel and David stepped inside, their faces, drawn clothes rumpled from travel, and shoulders carrying something heavier than luggage. I met them in the courtyard, my lavender plants swaying lightly in the sea breeze. For a moment no one spoke. I could see Rachel's eyes dart to the villa's archways, to Marco's still figure above, and then back to me. The silence held until I told them I knew everything. I knew about the $8 million. I knew about the conversations they thought I would never hear. I knew the calculations that turned my illness into a column on a balance sheet. Rachel's face crumpled. She said she was afraid I would be alone, afraid I could not care for myself. She admitted that David had convinced her that control over my assets was the safest way to protect me. David stood stiffly, eyes low, his voice careful as he spoke about his concerns for Rachel's future. I listened, but did not move. I told them the safeguards would stay in place. The will would not change. But there was another path if they wanted it. I spoke about Sanctuary by the Sea, my nonprofit to bring American seniors to Portugal for dignified care, freedom, and community. I told them they could help, but only if they understood that trust was rebuilt through actions, not words. The work would be hard, and the commitment real. Rachel nodded, her voice quiet but steady, saying she wanted to try. David glanced at Marco, then extended his hand. Marco accepted it with a measured grip. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Later, I stood on the balcony as the sun sank behind the water, the horizon a thin ribbon of gold. The courtyard below was empty now, but the gate stood open. Freedom, I thought, is knowing when to keep it closed and when to open it for yourself and for those who still have a chance to change. The sea whispered against the shore, carrying the promise that beginnings do not always wait for endings.